Act 1. The sign that shouldn't have appeared the morning the world went wrong didn't start with thunder, or wind, or even snow. It started with a sound beneath the earth, a low, shuddering groan that made Caleb Mercer stop halfway through buttoning his coat. He stood on the porch of his Wyoming sheep ranch, breath steaming in the cold. The sky over the Wind River Range should have been pale blue at sunrise, but today it glowed with a strange yellow-green tint, the same sickened color he'd seen once before. In the winter of 1918, the year the storm buried half the valley, and his father with it. Caleb was 52, built from weather and hard years, a man who didn't scare easily, but the silence that settled over the land now, that frightened him. The sheep were restless, hundreds of them pressing against the fence rails, stamping, shifting, lifting their heads toward the ridge as if listening to something only they could hear. The dogs wouldn't bark. The wind held its breath. And even the ravens, those black-winged scavengers that haunted his pastures, circled once and vanished eastward. Caleb stepped off the porch, boots crunching in the frost. A thin tremor rippled through the frozen ground again. He whispered, "Not again. Don't let it be that again." From the road came the creak of an old wagon. It was Elias Cowden, the oldest rancher in the region, skin like leather, spine bent like a bow. Elias didn't dismount. He just looked at the sky and spat. "Wind River remembers, Caleb," he said quietly, "and it takes back what it's owed." Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with cold. "What are you saying, old man?" Elias shook his head. "I seen this sky once, before the storm that took your pa. If you're smart, you'll bring the flock in early, before the ridge starts roaring." The old man flicked the reins and disappeared down the road, leaving Caleb staring at the sky that glowed like a bruise. He didn't believe in omens. He didn't believe in destiny, but he believed in weather, and in the way animals sensed what men refused to see. As he walked toward the pens, a sharp gust hit him, not from the west, where storms usually formed, but from the north, cutting down from the ridgeline like a blade. The wrong wind. The wind his father had once taught him to fear. Caleb's pulse kicked. He turned toward the ridge and froze. High up on the snowy slope, a single set of horse tracks cut across the white, heading straight into the mountains, and straight into whatever was coming. Someone had gone up there before dawn, someone riding alone. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Who in God's name is up there now? The earth rumbled again, and this time it felt like a warning. Act 2. The storm no man could fight it began just after noon. A wind that started as a whisper and rose in seconds to a shriek. A wall of white rolled across the plains, swallowing fences, trees, and sky. But it wasn't a normal blizzard. It was two weather fronts colliding over the high plains, twisting into a white cyclone, a storm that didn't fall from above but spun sideways, tearing across the land like a living thing. The sheep panicked immediately. 800 heads surged toward the open range, bleating in high, terrified cries that vanished into the roar of the wind. Caleb didn't hesitate. He threw the saddle on his bay mare. Daisy slammed the cinch down and kicked her into a run. Snow struck his face like broken glass. The wind shoved him sideways, nearly knocking him from the saddle. Daisy fought to stay upright as drifts rose faster than he'd ever seen, like waves of the ocean rising beneath them. "Come on, girl. Up the ridge. Keep going." But the ridge was disappearing. The world had become a spinning tunnel of white. He followed the sound of the flock, the frantic avalanche of hooves, but even that faded into the storm's screaming. The ground under Daisy lurched. A crack split the snow. A sheet of ice gave way beneath them. Caleb felt the world drop. Horse and rider toppled. Daisy slipped, legs scrambling for purchase. Then the mare fell hard on her side, sliding down a hidden bank. Caleb was thrown forward. He slammed into a drift so deep it swallowed him whole. Snow filled his mouth, his eyes, his ears. For one awful second he couldn't breathe. He thrashed upward, exploding through the powder with a gasp. The cold sank straight through his coat, biting his bones. "Daisy!" he shouted. The mare whinnied weakly from somewhere below him, but he couldn't see her, just swirling white and shadows. The sheep were gone. $750,000 of livestock gone into the storm. A man like Caleb Mercer didn't fear death. He feared loss, fear of losing everything he'd spent a lifetime building, just as his father had. He staggered to his feet, leaning into the wind, trying to orient himself. Then he saw it. Through the spinning chaos, through the madness of snow and wind, he caught a fleeting glimpse of movement high on the ridge. A rider, a dark silhouette against the white, moving with purpose, angled into the storm instead of away from it. The same tracks he'd seen at dawn. The rider was alive and heading deeper into the heart of the blizzard. Caleb wiped his eyes, trying to pierce the white veil. "Who are you?" he muttered. But the storm roared louder, cutting his voice to shreds. He didn't know it yet. But the stranger on that ridge was about to save his entire world. Not with fire, not with strength, but with knowledge of the land older than any map, and skills no one in Wind River Valley remembered anymore. Act 3, the woman from the ridge. The storm should have drowned everything: sound, shape, sense. But as Caleb fought to pull Daisy to her feet, another sound rose through the blizzard. A whistle, not sharp, not panicked. A long, wavering tone that drifted through the white like a thread of music. The sheep responded first. Their panicked bleating softened. Their frantic, directionless running turned into a slow, collective pivot, 800 heads turning toward the ridge as if obeying a command older than language. Caleb blinked snow from his eyes. A silhouette emerged. At first, it looked like the storm was taking shape, pulling itself into the form of a rider. Then, piece by piece, she appeared, cutting through the white as if the wind parted for her. A woman on a gray horse. She rode low in the saddle, body moving with the animal like she wasn't separate from it. Her coat snapped behind her, her gloved hand raised, not to shield her face, but to guide the sheep with a series of silent signals. Motions so precise, so confident. They didn't seem possible in winds like this. Caleb stared, unable to look away. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was reading it, moving with it the way a trout swims with a current. Her horse descended the ridge in a controlled slide, hooves cutting anchored steps into the slope. Each time the wind blasted, she shifted her weight, angled her shoulders, and the horse compensated instantly, trained not by force, but by familiarity. The sheep followed her in a diagonal line across the wind, the only safe direction in a storm, this violent. Caleb swallowed. No rancher in the Wind River Range used that method anymore. The last man he knew who understood it had died 20 years ago. Whoever she wasn't just competent. She was trained by someone who knew the old ways, the lost ways. The woman glanced toward Caleb as she passed, just long enough for him to see her eyes. A cold, steady blue-gray, the color of river ice. Then she leaned forward, urging her horse toward the lower pasture. The sheep surged behind her like a living river of wool. Caleb tried to mount Daisy again, but the mare trembled too hard. He stumbled instead, forcing his legs to follow, half running, half sliding after the woman who'd taken control of his entire livelihood without a word. For one terrifying moment, he thought he'd lose sight of her, but she didn't vanish. She led everything, every last terrified animal, straight toward the sheltered ravine behind the south barn. Exactly the spot Caleb himself would have chosen, if he'd been strong enough, or fast enough, or smart enough to reach the flock in time. He was none of those things today. But she was. When he finally staggered into the ravine, gasping, shaking, half frozen, he saw the impossible. The entire flock, 800 head, packed safely between the rock walls, protected from the worst of the storm. And the woman, already dismounted, checking her horse's legs with quick, efficient hands. Caleb forced air into his lungs and rasped, "Who? Who are you?" She didn't look up. "Just someone who owed the land a favor," she said. Her voice was steady. Too steady for someone who just danced with a white cyclone. Then she glanced at him for real, and her eyes flickered with something like recognition or warning. "Get your animals settled," she said, turning back to her horse. "Storm isn't done yet." Act 4. After the storm, no answers. By the time the wind died down, the sun had vanished behind a sky the color of cold steel. Snow lay in drifts 3 to 5 feet deep, sculpted by the cyclone into twisted shapes that looked almost unnatural. Caleb checked the sheep. Not one was missing. The relief hit so hard he had to lean against the barn wall to stay upright. The woman, who still had not given her name, moved among the flock with sure eyes, touching noses, checking hooves, lifting ears to look for frostbite. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need it. Every movement spoke of a lifetime with animals. Caleb approached.
You're freezing.
"Come inside,"
I've
he
got a
said.
fire going.
"You're freezing. I've got a fire going." "I'm fine." "You're not. Nobody rides through a storm like that and comes out fine." She paused, set down the hoof she was inspecting.
You're not.
"I've slept in colder," she said gently but firmly. "The shearing shed will do." The shed? With no heat? In temperatures dropping by the hour? "It'll kill you," Caleb said. "Not tonight," she replied, grabbing a handful of feed to scatter for the weakest ewes. "I'll leave at first light." He frowned. "You're not from town." "No." "You know this land." "I used to." That answer settled into him like a stone in his gut. He watched her work, how she crouched without hesitation, how she checked every latch, every rail, every injured hoof. She moved with a familiarity so deep it bordered on haunting. Finally, he asked, "Those signals you used, where'd you learn that ridge hand method?" Her jaw tightened. "Someone who doesn't teach it anymore." She turned away, making it clear the conversation was over. Caleb stood in the doorway of the shed, watching her unroll a thin bedroll on top of cold wooden boards. "Take the guest room," he said, trying one last time. "I said I'm fine, Mr. Mercer. Caleb Mercer." She nodded once. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He wanted to argue, to insist, to demand answers, but something about her posture, the quiet rigidity of it, told him she wouldn't bend. So he left her there, in the cold, against every instinct he had. As he walked back to his house, the full silence of the storm's aftermath wrapped around him. The kind of silence that made a man remember the things he tried hardest to forget. He'd survived storms before, but never with a stranger sleeping in his shed, and never with this feeling twisting in his chest. The feeling that she hadn't shown him the full truth yet. Or, maybe, that she couldn't. Act 5. The hidden truth the next morning. The cold was brutal, sharp enough to crack water troughs open like glass. Caleb trudged through the snow toward the shearing shed, a thermos of hot coffee in hand. The door was cracked open. Inside, he found her already working. But something was wrong. She braced herself against a stall rail, breath coming in shallow bursts. Her face was pale beneath the dirt and wind burn. Sweat beaded across her forehead despite the freezing air. "You need to sit down," Caleb said. She shook her head, swaying. "I need to finish checking the lambs, the weakest ones. They hide sickness in storms." Her voice trailed off as she staggered. Caleb dropped the thermos and lunged, catching her just before she collapsed. Her body felt weightless, too light for someone who had ridden through hell the day before. He lifted her easily. When her head rested against his chest, A quiet, broken whisper slipped from her lips. "Don't. Take me back." "Back where?" he asked, heart hammering. But she didn't answer. Her eyes rolled back, and she went limp. Caleb carried her to the house, laid her on the guest bed, and lit every lamp he had. He boiled water, fetched blankets, did everything he knew to fight cold and exhaustion, the same way he'd saved hypothermic lambs 100 times. Hours passed. Her fever climbed. She drifted in and out of consciousness. And then the past began to spill from her lips, not in clear sentences, but in broken fragments. Dust. So much dust. The sky turned brown. No rain.
Dust.
He said the creek would come back.
Sky
We
turned
sold the rams
brown.
first, then the ewes,
No
then the
rain.
lambs. He cried when the well dried, said the land didn't want us anymore. They made him sign the papers, said it was mercy.
Selling the rams,
My father,
then
my
the ewes,
father. Caleb
then the
froze.
lambs.
Dust storms, well dried, forced sale. Those were the marks of the worst Dust Bowl years. And suddenly, her strange familiarity with the land made sense. She hadn't learned those old ridge
Cried like
hand
a
methods
baby
from
when
a
the well
teacher.
dried.
She'd learned them from her father,
He said the
a
land
man
didn't
who had
want us
lived,
anymore.
worked, and died somewhere near this very valley. She murmured one more name, one that made Caleb straighten slowly, dread twisting in his stomach. Riggs. He took everything. He took the water. He took the land. Caleb sat heavily beside the bed, staring at her fever-flushed face. Riggs. Samuel Riggs. The same man who now represented the bank that threatened Caleb's ranch. The man whose name was whispered in every foreclosure story in the region. The man who had broken more families than any storm. And now, Caleb understood. The woman asleep in his bed, the woman who saved his flock, who rode through a white cyclone like she'd been born in it, was the daughter of a ranch Riggs had destroyed, a ranch that vanished during the Dust Bowl, a ranch that once existed right here in the Wind River Valley. Caleb leaned forward, brushing damp hair from her forehead as she shivered beneath the blankets. "Who are you really?" he whispered. But she was already lost to fever and dream. And Caleb knew one thing with absolute certainty. This woman hadn't come into his storm by chance. She had come back to the land that took everything from her, and to the man who once helped destroy her family. Only she didn't know it yet, and neither did Riggs. Act 6. Caleb's Truth. The fever broke on the third night. Caleb had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, chin resting on his chest, boots still on. When he woke, pale dawn light slid across the wooden floor, and the woman, the stranger he'd carried out of the storm, was awake. Her eyes were clearer, though rimmed with exhaustion. "You're safe," Caleb said softly. She blinked, taking in the room, the blankets, the steaming kettle on the stove nearby. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. Storm disagreed. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been resignation. "How long?" 2 days unconscious. Third, mostly fever dreams. He hesitated. "You said some things about your father, about losing your ranch." Her jaw tightened. "Then you know too much. I know enough to see you've been running for a long time." She looked away, toward the window glazed with frost. Caleb sat on the edge of the chair, leaning forward, elbows on knees. "If you're carrying ghosts, you're not the only one," he said quietly. She turned toward him slowly. Caleb almost never spoke about his past. Most days, he pretended it had dissolved into the same dust that swallowed entire towns during the bad years. But something inside him cracked open, maybe seeing how fiercely she worked to save animals that weren't hers. Maybe seeing her collapse trying, or maybe because in her fevered rambling, she'd spoken truths he'd been running from too. "I had a chance once," he began. "A good woman, smart, braver than me." He swallowed. "She asked me to leave the valley with her. Said a man didn't have to be chained to land that only knew how to take. The woman in the
Rumors
bed said
spread that I
nothing,
abandoned
just
you in
watched
the
him
storm,
with
that I
steady
rode home
eyes.
alone and
I
left you
told her
stranded.
no, Caleb continued. Said I had to rebuild my father's ranch, prove I wasn't weak, prove I could do what he couldn't. He shook his head, jaw working. Truth is, I was
I
scared.
built this place to
Scared that if
forget
I
what I'd
left, I'd have
lost.
nothing to measure myself against.
But land doesn't
Scared
let
she'd
you
see
forget
how little
anything.
I knew about being a man outside a fence line. What happened? She asked. Caleb let out a long, controlled breath. She left. And the worst part? People said I'd abandoned her during a storm, spread
You
rumors
aren't
that
the
I'd
man they
ridden
said
home
you were.
alone and left her stranded. She
And you
moved
aren't the
away
woman you
before I could
pretend to
set it
be.
right. He looked at his hands, rough and scarred from decades of winters. I built this place up as a way to forget what I'd lost. But land doesn't let you forget anything. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then she said, "You aren't the man they said you were, and you aren't the woman you pretend to be." She stared at the ceiling. "I used to think being alone made me strong." "That's what I thought too." Caleb stood. "But storms have
Rest.
a way of showing the truth."
There'll be time for
She
answers
closed her
when you're
eyes,
strong enough to
almost
speak
in
them.
surrender, not to him, but to something she'd carried far too long. Caleb pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders. "Rest," he said softly. "There'll be time for answers when you're strong enough to speak them." Act 7. The banker returns, and the past walks in. The snow had barely begun to thaw when the black automobile came rattling up the ranch road. Caleb felt his stomach sink before the engine even sputtered to a stop. Only one man in the region drove a car in winter, because only one didn't care if people hated him enough to sabotage it. Samuel Riggs, bank representative, foreclosure specialist, and the man whose name the fevered woman upstairs had whispered like a curse. Riggs stepped out, brushing
Rough
snow from
storm
his
we're
coat.
having.
Small eyes, hard smile, the kind of man who always arrived early to deliver bad news. "Mr. Mercer," Riggs said,
Feed
"rough storm, I
shortages,
hear."
vet bills,
Caleb didn't shake his hand.
repair
"What do you
costs.
want?" "Just routine assessment," the banker replied, examining the damaged fencing, the collapsed shed. "Storm losses add up.
Perhaps you might have to
Feed,
sell some land.
vet bills, repairs.
happening.
Shame, really." Riggs removed his gloves. "You're close to your credit limit, and with prices dropping." He gave a practiced sigh. "You may have to consider selling a portion of your
Here
land."
to ask about the woman on your
Caleb's
property.
jaw clenched. "Not happening." Riggs tilted his head. "I admire confidence, but numbers are numbers, no matter how
Drifter arrived in
sentimental a man might be.
town. A woman in a
Caleb
rough
stepped
coat and a gray
forward.
horse.
"What are you really here for?" Riggs's smile didn't falter. "To ask about the woman on your property."
Eliza Rowen.
The air froze between them. Caleb's pulse kicked once, hard. Riggs brushed snow from his sleeve. "A drifter came into town yesterday. Female, rough coat, gray horse. Matches the description of someone connected to an
He took the
unpleasant
water. He took the
foreclosure case
land.
years back." Caleb's voice dropped. "What's her name?" Riggs's eyes glinted. "Eliza Rowen." He said it
She's here,
casually,
she's trouble.
like the name meant nothing
For
to
you.
him, but it landed like a
And for
hammer
the
blow.
bank.
Caleb forced his expression to remain stone. Riggs continued. "Her family owed the bank a great deal. Dust Bowl hit them hard.
Cut
I was only
ties
doing my
before she
job,
costs you what
ensuring the
little you
land
have
transferred
left.
cleanly." Caleb remembered her feverish voice. "He took the water. He took the land." Riggs leaned closer. "If she's here, she's trouble. For you, and for the bank's interests." Caleb didn't blink. "And if she is here?" Riggs's smile returned like oil spreading across water. "Then I advise you to cut ties while you still can, before she costs you what little you have left." He put on his gloves, tipped his hat, and walked back to his car. Caleb watched the vehicle disappear down the road, breath shaking with rage he couldn't show. Not yet. He turned toward the house where Eliza rested. The past wasn't just returning. It had arrived in a black car with polished leather seats, and it knew her name. Act 8. Decision in the snow. Eliza insisted on walking the next day. Caleb tried to stop her. Your fever broke 12 hours ago. I'm fine, she said, though her legs trembled under her. No, you're not. I've been worse. He grabbed her arm to steady her. She pulled away, pride flaring like a match. I have to go, she said. I can't stay here, not after. She gestured vaguely toward the north road. Someone's come. I can feel it. Caleb swallowed. Eliza, Riggs was here. Her entire body went still. What did he say? That you're trouble. A hollow laugh escaped her. I am? No, Caleb said firmly. You're not. But she was already shaking her head. You don't understand. If he knows I'm alive, if he knows I came back here, he'll twist it. He'll use it against you, against your ranch. He'll make sure you lose everything, the same way he made sure my father. Her voice cracked.
What did he say?
She turned away, gripping the porch rail until her knuckles whitened. I won't be the reason another man loses his land, she whispered. I won't let that happen again. She shouldered her worn canvas bag, the same one she'd been carrying when she rode out of the storm. Caleb stepped in front of her. You're not walking into the cold alone. I have to. Eliza, he said quietly. Running isn't survival. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were tired. But beneath the exhaustion was something sharper, fear mixed with resolve. I don't want your help, she said. Too late, he replied. You already had it. She exhaled shakily. This is not your fight, isn't it? Caleb asked. He thought of the ridge hand signal she used, the sheep following her, the look in her eyes when she whispered Riggs's name, his father's ranch, her father's ranch, 2 stories broken by the same storm. He spoke softly. You came back to the land that hurt you. You faced a storm no one else could have ridden through. You saved what I couldn't save alone. If you walk away now, then the only person who wins is the one who destroyed you. Eliza closed her eyes, trembling. The wind picked up, scattering dry snow across the porch. Caleb took a slow step toward her, not as a demand, not as pity, but as something steady enough for another person to lean on. I don't want you gone by morning, he said. I want you here, to fight with me. Not for me, with me. For the first time since he'd met her, Eliza Rowen looked unsure. She looked down at her bag, then at the snow-covered fields. Then back into the house she'd been ready to leave. The silence stretched. Finally she whispered, If I stay, you could lose everything. Caleb nodded once. If you leave, I will. Her breath hitched, not from cold, slowly, painfully. She lowered the canvas bag to the floor, and for the first time since the storm began, something inside her let go, only a fraction, but enough. Caleb exhaled, tension breaking from his shoulders. Come inside, he said gently. Eliza stepped past him into the warm light of the house, not rescued, not defeated, but choosing to face what chased her. And somewhere in the drifting quiet outside, the land seemed to shift with them, as if acknowledging that the real storm was only just beginning. Act 9. The second storm and the break between them, snowmelt had begun to carve thin rivers through the fields by the time Caleb and Eliza were strong enough to walk the property together. The storm had stripped whole sections of fencing, buried troughs, and uprooted posts. But it had also revealed something else. A second front was coming. Weather instruments at the ranger station reported unusual barometric drops, too sharp, too sudden for spring. Caleb had survived enough winters to know what that meant, a late-season blizzard, the kind that hit fast and killed faster. Eliza saw it too. Her eyes kept drifting to the western horizon, where the mountains sat under a thick belt of dark clouds. The air had that uncanny stillness, the kind that made animals restless and men uneasy. They worked through the afternoon, strengthening what fences they could. The ground was soft, their boots sinking into thawing earth. Sheep grazed quietly nearby, unaware of the storm stalking them. It was late afternoon when Tom Patterson rode up, breath steaming. "Caleb," he called, "you two need to move fast. Ranger's office says this squall's got teeth."
Caleb,
Caleb nodded
the
grimly.
ranger's office
"We'll bring the
warns
flock down
this
tonight."
squall has teeth.
But Eliza stiffened. "The lambing field," she said. "The early births? If this storm drops fast, they'll die." Caleb turned to her. "Eliza, the main flock is 800 head. If they scatter, they
If this
won't
storm
scatter if
drops
someone
fast,
leads them.
they'll die.
Not in daylight. Daylight is almost gone." She stepped closer, jaw set in that iron way he'd come to recognize. "Those newborns can't be moved in this wind. They'll freeze before we hit the ridge trail. And the main flock will die if we don't move them," Caleb countered. Tom looked between them, uneasy. "You two need a plan." Eliza shook her head. "The plan is obvious. You go for the flock. I go to my father's old lambing shelter. It's lower in the valley, protected by the canyon wall. I can move the ewes and newborns inside before the
We'll lose
storm
the main
hits."
flock if we wait too
Caleb
long.
felt a cold twist deep in his chest, something more than fear. "No, I'm not letting you climb that canyon alone. You don't have a choice." "Eliza," she cut him off, voice low but steady.
I'll hit
"I
your
already
father's
lost
old lambing
everything once
shelter.
because someone waited too long to
Eliza,
act.
No.
I'm not letting those lambs die for the sake of anyone's comfort, not even yours." The words stung more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't an insult. It was a truth she'd
I'm
lived,
not letting you
and one
climb
she
that canyon
refused to
alone.
repeat.
You don't have a choice.
Caleb stepped back, jaw tight. "I can't be in two places at once." "I can," she replied. "You move the flock. I'll handle the newborns." Tom cleared his throat. "She's right, Caleb. Those lambs won't survive on open ground." The wind picked up suddenly, sharp,
I
cold,
can't.
a promise of what was coming. Eliza and Caleb faced each other, the storm line swelling behind them like a rising tide. "This will break wrong if we're not careful," he warned. "It will break worse if we do nothing." Silence stretched, filled with all the things neither could say.
It could break wrong.
Finally, Caleb nodded, the motion heavy, reluctant. "We split," he said quietly. Eliza tightened the worn strap on her canvas bag. Her father's old methods, buried for years, were suddenly needed again. As she turned toward the
split.
canyon trail, Caleb felt something inside him shift, something painful, like a fence post cracking under strain. "Be careful," he said. She didn't turn, but she lifted a hand, half wave, half promise, and kept walking. The storm rolled in behind them, swallowing the last of the daylight. And for the first time since she rode out of the blizzard weeks ago, Caleb felt the cold in a way that had nothing to do with winter. It was the cold of uncertainty, the cold of not knowing whether the land would spare them twice. Act 10. What the land gives back the storm came harder and faster than any forecast predicted. Caleb reached the high pasture just as the wind slammed into him like the broadside of a barn. Drifts formed in minutes. Snow cut sideways. The flock panicked, surging like a white sea in the failing light. But he did what he had watched Eliza do. He angled himself with the wind, moved diagonally across the slope. Let the storm push just enough to guide the flock without letting it scatter. His mare fought him, then trusted him. The sheep followed her, and together they carved a path back toward the ravine. By the time he had the flock secured, night had swallowed the valley whole. The storm shrieked across the plains in long, low roars. Caleb looked toward the canyon where Eliza had gone and felt dread knot tight in his stomach. She should have returned by now. He grabbed a lantern, mounted up, and forced Daisy toward the canyon trail. The wind nearly extinguished the flame. Snow battered his face. It felt like the storm was trying to shove him back each time he pushed forward. But he kept going. because he could not bear the thought of losing someone to the land again, not after the way she'd stood in his doorway with her canvas bag on the floor, not after the way she'd chosen to stay instead of run. The canyon walls finally rose around him, offering partial shelter from the wind. He pushed on, shouting into the storm, "Eliza! Eliza!" No answer. But then, a faint glow. He urged Daisy forward until he reached the old lambing shelter. Snow had piled high against its side, but the doorway was open, lantern light flickering inside. He rushed in and froze. Inside, the newborn lambs were gathered in makeshift pens built from broken boards and old railings. The ewes lay curled against them,
Eliza.
bleating softly. Every animal alive. And there, slumped against a beam with her hands still wrapped in rope and straw, was Eliza Rowen. Her coat was crusted with ice, her hair frozen against her cheek, her breathing shallow but steady. She had done it. She had saved every lamb in the canyon. Caleb knelt beside her, tapping her cheek gently.
You got him down?
"Eliza,
The flock
hey,
is safe now.
look at me." Her eyes fluttered open, barely. "You got them down?" she whispered. "Yes," Caleb said, voice thick. "They're safe, all of them." She let out a breath that fogged in the cold. "Good," she murmured, and her eyes closed again. Not from collapse this time, but from relief. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her carefully, and carried her out of the shelter. The storm howled above them, but the worst had already passed. The land had taken from both of them once. Tonight, it gave back. It took 3 days for the valley to thaw. 3 days before the town heard that Caleb Mercer and a drifter woman named Eliza Rowen had saved 2 ranches worth of animals during the worst late-season storm in 20 years. 3 days before the first knock sounded on Caleb's porch. It was Tom Patterson. Behind him stood half a dozen ranchers, and a boy, no older than 19 with hollow cheeks and dirt-worn boots. "Found him drifting near the county line," Tom said. "Says he used to work livestock. Lost his place last year. Reminded me of somebody." Eliza stood behind Caleb, still pale but recovering, one hand braced on the door frame. The boy avoided her eyes at first, until she stepped forward and said softly, "You hungry?" His voice cracked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you stay," she said. "But you rest before you work. That's the rule here." Caleb glanced at her, a silent understanding passing between them. Helping this boy wasn't charity. It was a continuation, a way to mend what had been broken in both of them. By autumn, the valley had changed. 2 ranches, Caleb's and Eliza's father's old land, functioned as one. New fences rose, fields greened under careful rotation. The lambing shelter was rebuilt stronger than before, and the boy they'd taken in, Daniel Ross, found steady footing under their guidance. People in town talked, as they always did, but this time, the talk carried respect. Some said the storm forged a new beginning. Others said the land simply chose the right people to give back to. But Caleb knew the truth. The storm hadn't saved them. What saved them was the moment when 2 people, hurt, chased, hardened by years of loss, finally stopped facing their storms alone. And though the land would always test them, always demand toil and sacrifice, it also offered something else, a chance to build again, a chance to belong, a chance to turn ruin into something that could outlast the winter. As the first snow of the new season drifted softly across the ridge, Caleb stood beside Eliza at the fence line, watching their flock graze in quiet peace. Wine River had taken many things over the years, but this time, at long last, it had given something back, a future, and neither of them would face it alone.